So first and foremost, we're responsible for ourselves. Now, it would be naive for Sartre to claim that and just leave it at that, right? So ultimately, the next scope of responsibilities, or the next area of what we are responsible to, I think very reasonably, and this I think points to kind of Sartre's insight and genius here, is he says we're responsible for others. That we live in a world with others. We live in a world where others' choices kind of either restrict or encourage our ability to make choices. Okay? So when we think about our responsibility in the world, yes, we are responsible for ourselves, but second, we are responsible for others. And how are we responsible for others? Through our choices. Then when I make a choice, right, if I were to choose to become a basketball player, right, then that very, very clearly influences your ability to make choices, right? And so thinking about kind of how our choices affect others and how our choices either kind of limits or encourages possibilities in the world for others is something that Sartre wants us to key in on. Okay? And he talks about this again in the reading here. Let me find it real quick. Right? He says, and when we say, no, that was French. And when we say that man takes responsibility for himself, we say more than that. He is, in his choices, responsible for all men. All our acts of creating ourselves create at the same time an image of man such as we believe he must be. Thus, our personal responsibility is vast because it engages all humanity. If I want, say, to marry and have children, such choice may depend on my situation, my passion, my desire, but by it I engage not only myself but all humanity in that way of monogamy. In fashioning myself, I fashion man, I fashion humanity. This helps us understand some rather grandiloquent words like anguish, abandonment, and despair, which we'll get here in just a little bit. Okay? And a couple of paragraphs down, right? Pardon me. Sorry. Where is it? Sorry. Should have found this here. That's frustrating. I apologize, students. Shoot. It's frustrating. All right. So essentially, going back to it, this idea that when one chooses for oneself, one chooses for all humanity. Ultimately, right, what happens here is he says, in fashioning myself and choosing for myself, I choose for all. I choose for all humans. And with that, what he means is ultimately that our choices, again, affect others. That if I want to choose to marry, have children, and live that kind of life, then I am making that kind of, I'm conforming that into the world of possibilities and limitations. Okay? And ultimately, the ideas of anguish or abandonment, which Sartre just mentioned, what happens is when we start to recognize the vast power and scope of our responsibility that comes with our choice, ultimately we might be kind of paralyzed and think about it in terms of being in angoisse or anguish. This idea that our choices carry so much weight in the world that sometimes maybe a natural inclination is to be scared or be weighed down by it, kind of on our shoulders. Okay? This idea that ultimately what we do when faced with this kind of anguish of choices and this anguish of how much we are actually responsible for, again, we turn to what is called bad faith. And again, we'll discuss that more tomorrow. So the first two scopes of responsibilities, I am responsible for myself, and then I am also responsible for all humanity. And how am I responsible for all humanity? I'm responsible for all humanity in terms of my choices. Okay? And what I was looking for in the text, again, it's translated a little bit differently, but essentially a couple paragraphs down, Sartre writes that when we think about how it is we ought to engage with others and how it is we ought to engage with humanity at large, we ought to engage with humanity in terms of something that we've already encountered in our little 4-week class. That he says, when I think about my choices, and I'm paraphrasing here, when I think about my choices and I think about how it is I ought to live, I ought to ask myself, what if everyone did as I am doing? What if everyone did as I am doing? Again, something along those lines. That is Kant's categorical imperative. When I think about my choices and if I ask myself, well, what if everyone did as I am doing? What if everyone acted the way that I am acting? What if everyone made this choice that I am choosing? What kind of world, what kind of, world would I be creating for myself and for others? And that's a challenging question. The third thing we're responsible to is for value. Value. That again, for Sartre, right? There is no God. There is no God-given value, the God-given meaning to existence. It's rather absurd. It's actually quite absurd when you start to strip away all of these things just on our day-to-day existence that really, think about it. This whole enterprise right now of me talking to a camera that you're watching somewhere, that's pretty absurd. That all of, the course of your life up to this point has led you to watch a video of me talking to you about existentialism is absurd. Right? And so when we think about value and we think about meaning, especially as it is concerned with Sartre and in his atheist existentialism, right? Well, the question becomes, well, where does value come about? Or how does value come about? Where does meaning come about? How is meaning understood? And again, it shouldn't be a surprise. It's understood in terms of choice. Sartre writes again in Existentialism as Humanism that when I choose something, I affirm it valuable. Because I wouldn't or I could have chosen otherwise. And when I chose, right, to buy this water bottle, I affirmed it valuable. When I chose, and when it gets to a point that it's no longer usable or I no longer kind of have a connection to it, then I'll go choose a different water bottle. Right? And I affirm that water bottle value. God has not come down. God has not come down to say, this red water bottle, because I assume God, if it's a male, anyway, has a booming voice, but this red water bottle is valuable. Right? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. So where's value understood? It's understood in terms of our choices. That, right? This water bottle is valuable because I, existing right now, have chosen it. I continue to choose it. Right? I chose to cut my hair this morning. Okay? So I affirm that enterprise of hair cutting valuable. Right? God didn't come down and say, well, your hair is invaluable or valuable. And well, I guess there was Samson and Delilah. Someone had hair in the Bible that was important, right? But when we think about value, and I think this is a really fascinating thing, that when we think about value, when we think about how our choices are indeed referential to what it is we value, we're left with something pretty powerful here, right? Where my values can very well change throughout my life. Okay? That I chose, 10 years ago to watch very different television than than what I watch today. Okay? Chose to watch really trashy television on popular TV stations that say they have music in the title but no longer do. No longer show any sort of music things. Right? Would watch reality TV, all of these things, right, that really, weren't that good, but that's what I was watching when 10 years ago. And so by choosing that, I affirmed it valuable. Now I choose to watch other things, and I affirm those other things valuable. Right? When I think about clothing styles, right, that God has not come down to say this one clothing style is better than this clothing style, right? But rather how we understand that in terms of values, we understand it in terms of value by the subjective nature of our choices. That's why I can wear this shirt and I've affirmed it valuable, and perhaps whatever it is that you are wearing, you've affirmed that valuable, and it could be very, very different than this shirt or this clothing style. That nowhere is it written about what, the almighty notion of this clothing style is best. Another good example of this is music. Right? That every one of us probably thinks that the music we listen to is better than other types of music. Okay, but to the extent that that's true is only because we've chosen to listen to that music, that we found something in those styles of music that we enjoy, that feel pleasing, not only emotionally and aesthetically, but they're pleasing, right? And so we choose to continually listen to that type of music. All the while, somebody else might very well be listening to music that we absolutely hate or disdain. But nevertheless, the reason why that music still has value is because it's still chosen. When I choose to go on a date with somebody, or when I choose to engage in a relationship, right? I'm affirming that valuable. When I choose to join a social organization or an organization in some regard, I'm affirming it valuable. So when we think about value in the world, again for Sartre, it is relegated and completely understood in terms of choice. And that ultimately our values can change because we might make different choices. We're responsible for that. We're responsible for what it is we choose, to value. That if I choose to belong to a particular organization, whether it be a sorority, fraternity, church organization, any one of those things, right? Well, then I'm responsible for that. I'm responsible for making that choice and affirming that thing valuable. Okay? I think this is a really fascinating thing, and I would really consider and challenge you all to kind of question this notion of Sartrean value, especially if we take away this notion of any sort of God-given value, right? Which kind of again leads us to this notion of the existentialist absurd, this notion of the existentialist notion of the absurd, that if there is no kind of God-given value, then what the hell are we doing, right? But nevertheless, it doesn't take away that things are valuable. And why are things valuable? Because we've chosen them. We've chosen them for our lives, in our lives. We've chosen people in our lives. We've chosen organizations in our lives. And we have affirmed those things valuable. All in the process of making us and making ourselves into what we will be. Now, corresponding to that, there's not much of a leap here, I don't think. But when we think about our choices in the world, okay, how do things have meaning? How does our existence, maybe the most fundamental question of all, how does our existence have meaning? It has meaning by our choices. It has meaning by what we choose to give meaning to. And again, this notion of subjectivism, this notion of subjective experience in the world, lends itself to understanding that various people think various things that might be diametrically opposed have meaning. Right? That the Judeo-Christian Western value system that the United States of America predominantly holds, more or less, I know that could be a very contentious statement, but I think that I don't actually think it's that contentious because I think it's kind of true. But the value system that it seems that America espouses, right, is very different than the value system that ISIS espouses, right? But nevertheless, all of these worldviews are meaningful to those that hold them. And when we think about conflict, when we think about global conflict, Global conflict is often understood in terms of a clashing of values, a clash of meaning on how we are to understand existence. And oftentimes, it's done in the name of a deity. It's done in the name of deities, right? That our God tells us to live this way, our God tells us to live this way. Why don't you believe it? Why don't you accept it? I'll make you accept it via force. Right? And that's very scary. On kind of a more simpler, perhaps, outlook with this idea of choice and meaning, think about, a really good example is if I were to ask you how many planets are in our solar system. Easy question. We've learned a lot growing up, right? 7, 8, 9. Okay. The notion of Sartrean take on meaning is that it's us who gives meaning, right? I grew up knowing that there were 9 planets, including Pluto. And somewhere along my upbringing, some people somewhere decided that no, Pluto's not going to make the cut anymore, right? So we're just going to boot him, boot her, boot it, right? Why? Why? Who gets to decide that, right? Humans do. Humans get to decide what counts and what doesn't count. That still, God has not come down to say, no, humans. Right? There are 9 planets in your solar system. There are 7 planets in your solar system. There are 8 planets in your solar system. No, right? That has yet to happen. Rather, it's up to humans' ability to choose and interpret and give and understand meaning. And this is really challenging. And this is really, I think, perhaps a troubling proposition for some. Because again, I think that there's a reasonable outlook out there, right? That how do we understand meaning in our world, meaning in our existence? We understand it in terms of what God has given meaning to. Well, Sartrean existentialism and other thoughts like it, kind of combat and push back on that notion of it. Because ultimately, if we think about meaning, if we think about value, if we think about the subjectivism that perhaps is inherent in the world, then maybe it is just us. Maybe it is just us. That's a really frightening thing for some. And that's why we take so much refuge and comfort in religious situations or religious institutions, social institutions, which is completely valid. Right? We search for meaning, we search for truth, we search for understanding in our existence. These fundamental questions, these fundamental desires, perhaps, of what it means to be human and what it means to exist. And for Sartre, what we find and what we understand is that everything is a choice. Everything is a choice born from our freedom to make choices. And what are we free to do? Our freedom, and that freedom is understood in terms of what we are responsible to. That our freedom, we are free to make choices, and we are responsible for those choices that we make. So I really do challenge you all to think heavily about this, because it is, I think, if thought about at the true powerful level of what Sartre is drawing our attention to, it's not easy. I think it's challenging. I think it's provocative. But I also think it's enlivening. I think for us to think about these fundamental propositions about existence, about who it is we are, who it is we want to become, how we're responsible to others, how does anything have any value, how does anything have any meaning, right? Those questions aren't going away. Those questions aren't going away. Tomorrow we'll talk about bad faith. We'll talk about what and how that is understood, and kind of the existentialist interest in living authentically. which I think is one of the most interesting questions of 2016, I think, is how does one live authentically? And are you living authentically?